The champagne in my glass had long gone warm, but I held it anyway, more shield than refreshment. From my position by the grand marble staircase, I watched the guests swirl across the ballroom floor of Clearwater Manor like choreographed ghosts. It was all pristine, crystal chandeliers, gold-trimmed ceilings, and floral arrangements so precise they looked unnatural. Everything Damien loved. Everything his mother had demanded. And yet, even in this opulence, I felt invisible. Damien's laughter echoed across the hall before I saw him. He was standing beside his mother, Genevieve Langford, their heads dipped close in shared amusement. I didn't need to hear the words to know they were speaking about me. It was in the way her eyes briefly flicked my way with that familiar look of indulgent disdain, like I was a social experiment gone wrong, something to be tolerated until it could be quietly undone. Window dressing, she had called me once during a charity brunch. I had overheard her in the powder room, dabbing her lipstick with a lace napkin as she muttered, "She looks the part, but that's all she is." Damien could have done so much better. Tonight, she didn't even bother to whisper. Damien glanced at me, then smirked. "She was a receptionist, you know," he said, voice dripping with irony. Picked her right out of the lobby like a fine bottle of scotch. Genevieve let out a sharp, satisfied laugh. At least a bottle of scotch improves with age. Their voices weren't hushed. If I could hear them from here, so could others. But no one said anything. No one ever did. Not to the Langfords. I swallowed the bitter lump rising in my throat and turned away, feigning interest in a gilded painting of some ancestor's fox hunt. The walls were lined with them, portraits of legacy and entitlement, all bearing the same severe expressions. And yet, in that moment, I couldn't help but picture my father, Caleb Mercer, standing in his worn corduroy jacket, sleeves rolled, sweat lining his brow as he tinkered with another blueprint. He never cared for these games. His world had been one of grit, not grandeur. I stepped outside onto the balcony, the chill in the night air a welcome relief from the heavy perfume and suffocating tension inside. Clearwater Manor's gardens sprawled below, manicured to perfection, but they reminded me of mazes, beautiful, but designed to trap. How'd I let myself get caught in all of this? A waiter passed, offering a tray of canapés I had no intention of eating. I declined with a tight smile and turned back toward the doors, just in time to see Genevieve making her way toward me. Her steps were deliberate, heels tapping in staccato rhythm. She didn't greet me when she arrived, just stood beside me, gaze fixed on the guests inside. "Pretty, isn't it?" she said, voice smooth as glass. The way everything comes together when you have the right people in charge. I didn't respond. I'd learned that silence unnerved her more than rebuttal. "You've done well for yourself, Evelyn. Climbing out of whatever modest pit you came from. I'm sure your father would be proud." What was it he did again? Owned a laundromat. My jaw tightened. He was an entrepreneur. Genevieve let out a light laugh, dismissive and cruel. "Is that what we're calling it now? How quaint." I turned to face her fully. He built his life from nothing. And he did it with integrity. Can your family say the same? Her smile faltered, just briefly, before returning. "Careful, dear. Gratitude becomes you far more than defiance. Damien has been patient." "With what, exactly?" "With your role. Your place." She leaned in slightly. "You were never meant to be more than ornamental, Evelyn. A suitable photograph for the holiday cards. Don't start confusing yourself with someone essential." I stared at her, searching for some sign of humanity behind those frostbitten eyes. There was none. As she walked away, the tremble in my hands returned. Not from fear, not even from humiliation, but from something rising in my chest I hadn't felt in far too long. Resolve. I re-entered the ballroom, chin high, steps slow and steady. Damien caught my eye as I passed and raised his glass with a mocking nod. I didn't flinch. Instead, I looked past him to the towering oil painting above the fireplace, one of the manor's founders, a stern-looking man with silver hair and cold eyes. For a moment, I imagined replacing it. Not with a Langford heir or some colonial relic, but with someone who had actually built something. Someone like my father. I reached for my phone. If they wanted to call me decoration, then fine. Let them. Because what they didn't know, what they would never suspect, was that the foundation beneath their feet wasn't nearly as solid as they believed. Not anymore. Not with me awake. And I had every intention of shaking it. There was a photograph I kept hidden in the back of my closet, tucked behind a stack of rarely worn scarves. It was frayed at the corners, the color sun-faded, but every time I looked at it, the memory rushed back in perfect clarity. My father, Caleb Mercer, standing barefoot on a wooden dock somewhere in Fiji, his face wind-chapped and glowing, his arm around me while the ocean frothed behind us. He wore a linen shirt with the sleeves rolled up, sunburn creeping across his collar. I must have been 12, grinning with all my teeth, no makeup, no expectations, no Clearwater Manor in sight. That was who I had been before the Langfords. Before Damien. Before this version of my life swallowed me whole. People thought they knew my father. They assumed he was just another small-town man with a decent business and a lucky break. Even Genevieve had once dismissed him as a provincial with delusions of ambition. But they were all wrong. Caleb Mercer didn't just dream, he built. Quietly, intentionally, and far from the spotlight, he constructed an empire that no one in the gilded circles of society ever saw coming. Including me. It had started as whispers in our house, late-night phone calls in languages I didn't understand, thick envelopes arriving from overseas, spreadsheets scribbled with codes instead of names. As a child, I thought it was part of some grand game. My father never explained, but he always involved me. He'd pull me into his study and say, "Evelyn, if you were designing a place that made people feel safe, what would it need?" I'd give answers like warm towels and soft music and hammocks by the water, and he'd nod thoughtfully, as if I'd just given him a billion-dollar idea. Only after he died did I begin to piece it together, fragments of phone calls, strange maps, coded journals. But tonight, sitting cross-legged on the floor of my closet with that photograph in my lap, the truth was finally beginning to crystallize. My father had been building something enormous. Not just a resort. Not just a brand. A network. Hidden. Intentional. Visionary. Clearwater Manor's silence echoed down the hallway beyond my closet door. Damien was likely still downstairs, drinking scotch with the last of the guests, or maybe plotting whatever his next step would be after tonight's public embarrassment. But I wasn't thinking about him. I was chasing ghosts. I pulled out an old keepsake box and rummaged through it until I found the leather-bound journal I hadn't touched in years. My father's handwriting greeted me like an old friend, sharp, angular strokes, always written with his favorite Montblanc pen. Flipping through the pages, I noticed something I had missed as a teenager: the names of resorts. Dozens of them. None of them familiar. No branding. No websites. Just coordinates, purchase dates, coded references to shell companies. A whisper of memory tugged at me: Paris in the winter, tucked away in a boutique inn with stained glass windows and lavender sachets under the pillows. Thailand the following spring, where a man named Arun greeted us like royalty though we'd never met before. A cabin in the Swiss Alps where the staff refused tips and served cocoa by firelight. These weren't just vacations. They were his properties. His sanctuaries. He never needed the validation of the world's elite. While the Langfords paraded their acquisitions and name-dropped legacy institutions, my father was constructing an empire in the shadows. No press. No bragging. Just elegance and purpose. It struck me then how clever he had been, hiding in plain sight by making each resort feel personal, humble, almost accidental. But they were anything but. I turned the journal to the final page and found a phrase he had written over and over: "Legacy isn't what you leave behind. It's what you protect while you're still here." A slow chill moved down my spine. He had known. Maybe not about the Langfords specifically, but he had known the world would try to dismantle me. Prepare her, he must have thought. Arm her with pieces, so she'll know how to rebuild when the storm comes. And the storm had arrived. I closed the journal and pressed it to my chest. My hands were shaking, not with fear but with the electric buzz of revelation. The Langfords saw me as an ornamental pawn. Damien saw me as a convenient face for their empire. But they didn't realize I had the blueprints to an entirely different kingdom. One that didn't belong to them. one they didn't even know existed. I stood and walked to the mirror, staring at my reflection for longer than I usually dared. My features were softer than Genevieve's, my voice quieter, my presence less commanding. But beneath the surface, I carried a map, a web of secrets passed down by a man the world had underestimated. Just like they had underestimated me. Tonight had been humiliating. But it had also been clarifying. They thought I was born into this life by accident. They had no idea I came from something far more deliberate. And now, I knew exactly where to begin. I didn't go looking for it. That's what I told myself later as I sat frozen in the chair behind Damien's massive mahogany desk, the edges of the document still quivering in my hands. The study smelled like cigars and varnish, the scent of a man who wanted the world to believe he had control over everything. But control wasn't what I saw in these papers. What I saw was betrayal, carefully typed in clean legal fonts, signed and notarized in ink as black as the hollow feeling growing in my chest. The folder had been left carelessly on the edge of the desk, as if Damien hadn't imagined I'd ever come in here alone, much less read something that wasn't meant for my eyes. I'd only come to find my gloves. My silk ones, the pair with the mother-of-pearl buttons he insisted I wear to formal functions. I was supposed to attend some event with him tomorrow, an investor dinner where I'd be expected to smile and say nothing of substance. But then I saw my name on the tab, Mercer Trust Review. Curiosity stopped being innocent the second I opened that folder. The first page was dry. Legal language. A lot of whereas and heretofore. But then I saw the highlighted sentence. Declaration of incompetence in financial governance. Grounds for reassignment of trust management and strategic holdings under Clause 14(c) of prenuptial contract. I didn't understand it all at first. So I read it again. And again. My name appeared over and over. Evelyn Mercer Langford. Subject to review. Lacking sufficient experience. Exhibiting undue emotional instability. Not adequately equipped to handle the complex operations of Ravenshade Retreat. That phrase. That lie. That weapon. It was all here. A plan to remove me from decision-making authority, using the very documents I had signed at the start of our marriage. Documents I hadn't read closely because I had trusted him. Because he had said, "It's standard, sweetheart." Just legal stuff to keep the Langford name clean in case of divorce. I was 24 and in love. Or, at least, in the kind of awe that looks like love when you don't know better. He had swept me into his world with tuxedos and wine tastings, declarations about building a life together. I had wanted so badly to believe I belonged in his world that I didn't notice when he started locking doors behind me. This wasn't just about money. It was about Ravenshade. I flipped through the pages until I found the attachment, an internal memo outlining the transfer of Ravenshade Retreat to full Langford ownership. They planned to restructure operations to align with broader Langford hospitality strategies. But that wasn't what my father wanted. Ravenshade had been the first resort he ever built under the radar, the one he had entrusted to me just before his death. I could still hear him whispering in the hospital room, "It's yours now, Evie. Do right by it." I remembered how he had showed me the land when I was 17. We stood on the cliffside as the ocean churned below, wind roaring in our ears, and he said, "This place, Evelyn, it's not about luxury. It's about return. About finding your way back when the world forgets who you are." And now Damien wanted to gut it, turn it into another soulless shell lined with imported marble and fake smiles. The study door creaked behind me, and I froze, my breath caught mid-thought. But it was only the wind pushing against the latch. I stood and backed away from the desk, the papers still in my hand, their edges biting into my skin. How long had this been in motion? How many meetings had Damien had behind my back? Had Genevieve helped him draft this betrayal over coffee and croissants while I sat in the next room planning gala menus and color palettes? I looked around the room, at the bookshelves lined with antique volumes Damien had never read, the vintage globe he liked to spin for effect, the framed photos of Langford patriarchs looking severe and smug. There were no photos of us. Not a single one. I thought of the nights I had stood beside him at events, playing the perfect wife. I remembered the subtle corrections he'd make when I spoke, how he'd touch my elbow like a signal, how he'd laugh just a bit too loud at my expense, always with that glint in his eye like he was doing me a favor by keeping me close. I had mistaken manipulation for sophistication. I had mistaken cruelty for charm. Not anymore. I tucked the documents back into the folder, but not before snapping photos with my phone, every page, every signature. Evidence. I wasn't sure what I'd do with it yet, but I knew better than to leave them untouched. Damien might think I was soft, but I had been raised by Caleb Mercer. And if there was one thing he taught me, it was that the moment you see the trap, you stop pretending it's not there. I took one last look around the study, then turned off the lamp and closed the door behind me, walking quietly back to my suite like nothing had happened. But everything had changed. Let them think I was still asleep. I was wide awake now. I stared at my reflection in the bathroom mirror for longer than I should have. The soft morning light slanted through the frosted windows, turning the marble tiles golden, but my face remained pale, expression unreadable. Somewhere downstairs, the staff was setting out brunch trays and fresh linens for another curated Langford weekend. But up here, behind this polished facade, something else was stirring, something deliberate, steady, and dangerously calm. I hadn't slept much since discovering Damien's documents. There had been no confrontation, no dramatic blowout. That would have been too easy. Too loud. Instead, I chose silence. Observation. Strategy. The Langfords thrived in spectacle. I would dismantle them in quiet. The first thing I did that morning was pick up the phone and call Judith Ramirez. Evelyn. Her voice hadn't changed. Smooth, patient, always with a trace of steel beneath the surface. She had been my father's attorney for over 2 decades, his confidant, his safeguard against the world. The last time I'd seen her was at his memorial, where she had given me a tight hug and whispered, "He gave you more than you know." At the time, I didn't understand what she meant. Now I did. "I need your help," I said simply. There was no hesitation. "Say when and where." Within hours, we met in a private room at the Birch and Vale Club, an off-the-radar lounge where discretion was a requirement, not a courtesy. Judith arrived with her signature leather briefcase and the same sharp gray blazer she wore to every important meeting. We didn't bother with pleasantries. I laid everything out, the folder I'd found, the photographs I'd taken, the clauses Damien planned to exploit, the twisted language meant to paint me as some emotional liability. I expected outrage from her, maybe indignation or sympathy. But Judith merely nodded, calm and unreadable. "I've been waiting for this," she said, flipping through the photos on my phone. I blinked. "You knew." I suspected. Caleb didn't trust Damien. Not for a second. He said the man smiled too easily and asked too few questions. She closed the phone and set it aside. "Your father built in safeguards layers of them. The Langfords think they've been circling a wounded bird. What they don't realize is that Caleb left you with talents." That's when she showed me the documents, thick, carefully preserved files with my name typed in bold at the top. The first page took my breath away. Evelyn Mercer, sole owner, Orion Holdings Group. I stared at it, heart pounding, lips slightly parted. "What is this?" "Your father's legacy," Judith said gently. He didn't want the world to know what he built. He feared it would be picked apart, repackaged, sold by men like Damien. So he formed Orion Holdings, a private umbrella corporation, never directly linked to his public ventures. Under it, he built and purchased over 30 luxury resort properties worldwide. Quietly. Intentionally. In your name. I looked up at her. But I was just a teenager. Exactly. It kept you protected. No one thought to look at you. Not then. And when you married into the Langfords, the assets were kept in trust. Sealed, hidden, legal but invisible. She leaned forward. "You don't just own Ravenshade, Evelyn. You own everything." The room tilted for a moment as I tried to absorb the scale of it. 30 resorts. 30 sanctuaries built under the radar of the same people now trying to control me. My father hadn't just left me a fortune, he'd left me a weapon. Judith's eyes locked on mine. "We can act now. Freeze accounts. Shut off access. The Langfords will never see it coming." I shook my head slowly, a strange calm settling over me. "Not yet." Let them think they've already won. Let them keep smiling. I stood and walked to the window, watching the rain start to fall over the manicured streets below. We'll move soon. But when we do, it won't be a slap. It'll be a scalpel. The plan began taking shape that night. Judith and I pored over contracts and structures, tracing every asset, mapping out every shell company, identifying every loophole we could close before they noticed. I didn't tell anyone, not my friends, not even the household staff. I let Damien continue as he always did, charming at public dinners, indifferent at home. I smiled beside him, nodded through meetings, pretended to be distracted by floral arrangements and seasonal menus. But behind that smile, I was preparing for war. The strangest part was how peaceful it all felt. Like stepping into a version of myself I had always known was there but hadn't dared to awaken. I moved through the world deliberately, quietly, letting the Langfords believe their insult at Clearwater Manor had broken me. They had no idea it had built me. Every morning, I sat in the same chair in my father's old study and reread his journals. I traced his notes, reread his letters, memorized his mantras. He had warned me, in his own way, of what people like the Langfords would try to do. But he had also given me the tools to rise above it. Caleb Mercer never shouted. He outbuilt his enemies. And now, so would I. The storm hadn't hit yet. But I was ready. The air was too still, the silence too loud. This was the calm, the beautiful, terrible calm, before everything shattered. I learned something valuable from watching Damien over the years. He never saw a threat unless it arrived in a tailored suit or whispered his name in reverence. He believed power was noise, influence, applause. What he never understood, what his entire family never understood, was that true power is silence sharpened into a blade. And I had been sharpening mine in secret. After Judith confirmed my full ownership of Orion Holdings, we didn't rush. That was the difference between panic and strategy. We moved precisely with purpose. We examined every account tied to Orion and its subsidiaries, cross-checked every Langford fingerprint left on any ledger, account, or executive board. There were more than I'd anticipated. Damien and Genevieve had been busy, positioning Langford surrogates in minor executive roles, slipping themselves into advisory panels under shell corporations. They'd been planting roots in soil that never belonged to them. It was time to rip them out. The first action was quiet. Judith submitted a revocation notice to the internal finance teams of Orion's international properties, citing breach of contract and conflict of interest. I signed it with steady hands. Within 24 hours, all Langford access to Orion's central financial accounts was suspended, every password reset, every digital fingerprint scrubbed. Damien would notice soon enough. Not when he checked his personal account, those were safe, for now, but when his investment team found their hands suddenly empty, unable to shuffle numbers or execute trades. The second move was surgical. Judith filed dissolution orders on the 3 shell companies Damien had been using to veil his growing interest in Ravenshade Retreat. He'd created them quietly, each layered behind a dummy LLC, registered under obscure international law firms. It took days to untangle, but once we had enough evidence of intent, it was easy to dismantle them. One by one, those entities evaporated, no assets, no access, no leverage. Still, I said nothing. At home, I played the part flawlessly. I sat beside Damien at charity functions and nodded while he boasted about future expansions. I listened as Genevieve chirped about refining the Ravenshade experience with corporate consultants and branding experts. Every time she spoke, I imagined the cold thrill of watching her realize none of it belonged to her. Not one stone. Not one blade of grass. My silence wasn't submission, it was anticipation. At night, while Damien slept beside me, I worked. I studied cash flows and board notes. I reviewed staffing structures at each resort. I wrote and rewrote emails, each one cold, professional, exact. My language was never emotional, never defensive. It was law, structure, fact. That was something the Langfords didn't expect from me. They had mistaken my quiet nature for ignorance, my gentleness for weakness. But I had learned from the best. Caleb Mercer built everything brick by brick. So would I. Only this time, the bricks would be made of dismantled arrogance and carefully documented betrayal. One by one, Langford appointees were dismissed from Orion subsidiaries. We cited mismanagement, undisclosed conflicts, and clauses buried deep in contracts they hadn't read closely enough. Most of them didn't protest. They assumed it was an internal restructuring. Only one called me directly, confused, stammering. I told him, gently, that his services were no longer needed. He never called again. Judith and I expanded our reach to the public records. We updated ownership listings, ensuring Orion Holdings was clearly and legally tied to me, Evelyn Mercer, in every jurisdiction. The Langfords had been counting on the ambiguity of private holdings. Now that ambiguity was gone. The world would see the truth soon enough. Still, I waited. The power wasn't in the announcement, it was in the erosion. Let them feel the ground shifting before the landslide hit. Let them try to steady themselves while the walls came down. The only moment I came close to breaking was when I returned to Ravenshade Retreat. I hadn't visited since the first anniversary of my father's passing. But now, as I stepped out of the car and looked up at the weathered wood beams and glass-paneled facade, something inside me cracked and healed in the same breath. It was untouched. Still beautiful. The staff greeted me not with scripted politeness, but with recognition. Respect. They knew who I was. Who my father had been. No one asked what the Langfords wanted. No one asked why I'd come. I spent that night walking the cliffside trail Caleb had once shown me. I stood at the overlook where we'd scattered his ashes and whispered, "It's almost done." I imagined him standing beside me, hands in his pockets, smiling quietly the way he always did when he knew something no one else did. By the time I returned to Clearwater, the boardrooms were echoing. Whispers had begun. Langford advisors were questioning unusual terminations. Damien's finance team was growing frantic about locked portals and frozen transfers. The Langfords hadn't been publicly hit yet, but the tremors were everywhere. And still, I said nothing. I dressed for breakfast as usual. Kissed Damien's cheek. Let him rattle off plans for a Miami expansion that would never happen. He didn't know yet that the empire he'd tried to steal had never been his to begin with. But he would. Soon. Very soon. I sat alone in the top-floor suite of a modest beachfront resort in Nova Scotia, watching the sun rise slowly over the horizon. It was one of my father's properties, the Mirabelle Shore. I hadn't visited it since I was 19, when Caleb brought me here for what he called a quiet reset. He said the wind here spoke with a gentler voice, that it helped him think. And now, so many years later, with the wind teasing the curtains and the soft crash of waves below, I understood what he meant. It was the fourth property I had visited in the last 2 weeks. One by one, I was walking into the world my father had built, not as his daughter or Damien's wife, but as Evelyn Mercer, sole proprietor of Orion Holdings, and now the architect of its rebirth. But this place was different. Something about it felt deeper, more sacred. I ran my hand along the oak armrest of the chair I sat in and noticed initials carved faintly into the wood, CM plus EM. We had done that together. A forgotten memory, etched into something real. The resort manager, a silver-haired woman named Lila, knocked gently on the door. "Sorry to disturb, Ms. Mercer. You asked me to bring this up as soon as we found it." She handed me a leather binder, aged, soft at the corners. No logo, just a slip of ribbon tied around the middle. My name was written on the tag in my father's unmistakable script. "Evelyn, when you're ready." I sat still for a long time after Lila left. My fingers traced the edge of the ribbon, my breath catching in anticipation. He must have left it here for me. Buried it in the place where he always said his thoughts were clearest. Slowly, I untied it. Inside were handwritten notes, sketches, photographs, and letters, some addressed to me, some to Judith, and some simply labeled with a single word, Halcyon. At first, I didn't understand what it was. There were outlines of operational procedures, floor plans, case notes, and even coded check-in systems. But as I flipped through the pages, I began to see the full shape of his vision. This wasn't just about resorts. This was about refuge. Each of the properties had been designed with a dual purpose, not just as high-end retreats, but as sanctuaries. Safe havens. My father had partnered with discreet advocacy networks, trauma counselors, and support organizations. Women escaping abuse. Children caught in the cracks of broken systems. Men discarded by powerful families for daring to speak. People who had been silenced, manipulated, or financially entrapped. He'd created an invisible network of healing, hidden in plain sight. Halcyon was the codename he gave it. He had written at the beginning of one page, "The world will never stop trying to break people who don't fit its mold. We cannot stop all the breaking, but we can build places for the pieces to rest." Tears slipped down my cheeks before I even realized I was crying. He never told me, not directly. But the signs had been there, in all those gentle questions he asked when I was younger. How do you make someone feel safe without saying a word? What does dignity look like when no one is watching? If you could give someone a new beginning, how would it feel? I used to think he was just trying to teach me about hospitality. Now I saw he was trying to teach me about humanity. The Langfords had spent years calling me weak, passive, naive. Even Damien said I was too soft to run a business. And yet here I sat, holding the blueprint to an empire rooted not in profit, but in purpose. It was strength they couldn't even fathom, the kind that didn't need to shout to be heard. I spent the rest of the day going through every page, every detail. Judith joined me that evening, summoned quietly, and when I showed her the binder, she didn't look surprised. "He wanted you to find it," she said, folding her hands in her lap. "He trusted your heart more than anyone's mind. That's why he didn't leave it with me." We talked into the night, the two of us cross-referencing documents, updating records, setting timelines. Halcyon would be revived. But it would not be hidden anymore. Under my direction, Orion Holdings would be transformed into something greater, something that defied the cynical architecture of the Langfords' world. We would redesign the resorts to include therapeutic services, education opportunities, legal aid connections, and silent intake processes for guests in need. No press. No performative branding. Just action. I drafted a new mission statement that night, one line at a time. Halcyon sanctuaries exist to restore what was broken, in spaces built for healing, with dignity and peace as the foundation. As the candles burned low and Judith drifted off in the armchair beside me, I looked back at the final page of my father's binder. In his neat, unwavering hand, he had written, "This isn't about saving everyone. It's about saving someone. One person at a time. Start there." And I would. Starting with myself. The Langford Legacy Ball was a production, every year more extravagant, more calculated, more hollow. It was the kind of event where people didn't come to celebrate anything real, they came to be seen. The ballroom at the Meridian Pavilion glittered with opulence that night, tiers of champagne pyramids, chandeliers that threatened to crush you with their grandeur, and guests dressed like they were auditioning for royalty. And somewhere in the middle of it all stood Damien, his hand resting lightly on my back, as if we were still the couple they all believed us to be. "You look stunning," he whispered to me as cameras clicked nearby. "Like you actually belong here." I didn't smile. I didn't need to anymore. He had no idea what was coming. The final phase had been weeks in the making, every asset secured, every document verified, every betrayal catalogued. Judith had ensured that media outlets were pre-briefed with embargoed stories. Our legal team stood by, waiting to deliver papers to the right hands at the exact right moment. It wasn't revenge. It was justice, carried out with the precision of a scalpel. Genevieve made her entrance halfway through the evening, cloaked in a floor-length black gown adorned with diamond brooches. Her eyes scanned the crowd like a queen surveying her kingdom, but her expression faltered when she caught sight of me standing by the stage. She approached with a glass of wine in one hand and a smirk in the other. "Evelyn," she said coolly. "I must say, I'm surprised to see you here tonight. I assumed you'd be licking your wounds somewhere." I tilted my head. "You always did underestimate me." She blinked, clearly unsure if it was an insult. I didn't wait for her to catch up. I turned toward the stage, where the event coordinator stood, whispering nervously into a headset. She looked at me with wide eyes as I approached, unsure of what to do, but Judith's presence behind me gave her pause. She stepped back. The music cut out, and the murmuring crowd turned toward the podium in confusion. Damien noticed the shift and began weaving through the guests to stop me, but he was too late. I stepped up to the microphone and looked out over the sea of glittering judgment. "My name is Evelyn Mercer," I began, my voice clear, amplified, unshaken. "And I've been quiet for far too long." The room stilled. I was invited tonight as decoration, as I often am. A suitable accessory. The woman who appeared out of nowhere, molded to fit this world, until she no longer did. But I am not an accessory. I am not a mistake. I am not a placeholder until something better comes along. And I am not going to be silent while others rewrite my story. There were murmurs. I continued. "Several months ago, I discovered an orchestrated effort, led by Damien Langford and sanctioned by Genevieve Langford, to seize control of Ravenshade Retreat and, by extension, the holdings of Orion Group. They used deception, legal manipulation, and a gross underestimation of my intelligence to set their plans in motion." Damien had reached the edge of the stage now, his eyes wide, his mouth open as if preparing some charming deflection. But I raised a hand, and for the first time in our marriage, he stopped. "What they didn't count on," I said, "was that Orion Holdings belonged to me. Fully, legally, irrevocably. What they didn't know was that I had spent every minute since that discovery reclaiming what was mine." I lifted the documents from the folder Judith handed me and held them up. "These are verified ownership records. Sealed court filings. Corporate restructuring orders. Every claim I make tonight is documented and real." Gasps rippled through the crowd as journalists in the wings began filming, snapping photos, scribbling notes. Then I pulled out the final page. "And finally, here is proof, financial and legal, of Genevieve Langford's embezzlement of Orion's subsidiary funds through her so-called consultancy firm, Langford Solutions. Over $4.2 million siphoned over the last 6 years." Genevieve's face drained of color. Damien turned to her in disbelief, but I wasn't finished. "These funds were hidden through offshore accounts, false invoices, and internal fraud. And as of tonight, legal proceedings have begun. You are no longer shielded by your name, your social circles, or your legacy." Genevieve sputtered something, stepping forward, but Judith calmly handed her a copy of the court summons. Damien tried to take it from her, but a second envelope was placed directly in his hands. I took a breath and looked out over the stunned guests. For those of you who've watched me sit in silence, who've smiled at me while mocking me behind closed doors, know this: the woman you ignored has taken back everything. And I will not be erased. There was no applause. No laughter. Only stunned silence and the hum of cameras catching every second. I stepped down from the stage. Judith fell into step beside me, her voice low. "You've just pulled the pin from a very public grenade." "Yes," I whispered, not looking back. "And I'm walking away while it lands exactly where it should." The Langfords began to fall before dawn. It started with silence. Not a restful kind, not the peace of a long day ended, but the cold, unnatural quiet that fills the air just before something breaks. My phone vibrated once, twice, then continuously as media outlets began releasing the embargoed stories Judith had arranged. Headlines lit up every feed. Langford's under investigation for corporate fraud. Evelyn Mercer declares ownership of Orion Holdings in stunning gala reveal. The heiress they overlooked, how Evelyn Mercer took back her empire. By morning, Damien's phone was ringing nonstop. He didn't answer it. He just sat at the edge of the bed, staring blankly at the carpet. The weight of public disgrace didn't settle on him like it would for most people, it suffocated. His entire life had been built on image, illusion, and the assumption that power insulated you from consequence. And now the illusion had shattered. Genevieve didn't even come home that night. According to the staff, she left the ball in silence, her driver instructed to take her straight to the estate in the countryside. Judith confirmed the court officials had arrived shortly after, handing over legal notifications and freezing her accounts. Everything she thought was untouchable had already begun slipping through her fingers. I stood at the window, arms folded, watching the pale morning light bleed across the skyline. There was no gloating in my chest, no triumph pulsing in my veins. What I felt instead was something simpler. Truth settling into place. Like a crooked frame finally leveled. Like something wrong finally made right. By midday, the financial damage had spread. The Langford Group's stock value plummeted as investors withdrew in droves. Executives scrambled, distancing themselves from Genevieve and Damien, claiming ignorance. Board members resigned publicly, one after the other, their statements carefully worded, hollow apologies wrapped in legal armor. Damien tried to speak to me once, just after his father called and yelled at him loud enough for me to hear every syllable through the door. He came into the living room, eyes bloodshot, voice low. "You planned this." I looked up from the stack of documents I was reviewing. "I protected what was mine. You humiliated us." "No, Damien," I said calmly. "You did that to yourself. I just stopped hiding it for you." His jaw twitched. He wasn't used to my voice like this, unshaken, firm. He used to dismiss it when I spoke too softly, used to wave it away like an annoying breeze. Now, I could see him struggling to reconcile the woman he thought he married with the one sitting in front of him, unraveling everything he thought he controlled. "You think this makes you better than us?" he hissed. "You'll be eaten alive by the people you're trying to impress." I stood slowly, not out of anger but certainty. "I'm not trying to impress anyone. I'm rebuilding what your family tried to destroy. And you can either step out of the way or get buried in the collapse." He stared at me for a long time. But there was nothing left for him to say. By evening, paparazzi were stationed at the end of the estate's drive. The press conference Judith held earlier that day had gone viral, her poised, professional delivery outlining the legal basis for my actions. She never once uttered a word of malice. She didn't have to. The facts were louder than any insult. Genevieve was indicted on 4 counts of corporate fraud and tax evasion. Damien's name was dragged through every headline as the co-conspirator spouse, and while no charges had been filed yet, it was only a matter of time. The Langford reputation, once gilded with tradition and exclusivity, now lay in ruin, crumbling under the weight of its own deception. That night, I received dozens of messages, people who had known me from years ago, colleagues of my father, even distant guests from resorts he'd once helped open. Most had never bothered to reach out before. They apologized. They congratulated. They marveled at what I'd done. But I didn't respond to any of them. Not yet. I walked alone through the empty Langford gallery, portraits of stern-faced ancestors glaring down from gilded frames, shelves of curated artifacts that meant nothing to me. This house had never been a home. It had been a mask, a museum built to showcase perfection while hiding rot. I stopped in front of the painting of Damien's grandfather, the one Genevieve always insisted remain above the fireplace. I stared at him, then at my reflection in the glass. There was no trace of fear in my face anymore. I reached up, lifted the portrait off its hook, and set it carefully on the floor. When I returned upstairs, I didn't pack. I didn't need to. I would leave tomorrow, and not just the house. The whole chapter. The whole performance. It had served its purpose, and now it was over. The Langfords had fallen, not by scandalous accident, but by precise, earned reckoning. And I didn't even have to raise my voice. They had mocked my silence for years. But in the end, silence is what undid them. Silence, followed by truth. The rebrand announcement wasn't held in a ballroom or broadcast across gilded airwaves. There were no velvet ropes or crystal chandeliers, no press lines or choreographed photo ops. I chose a quiet courtyard in Barcelona, sun-drenched, fragrant with orange blossoms, and surrounded by one of the original Orion properties my father had purchased decades ago under an alias. It was the kind of space that breathed calm into your bones. That was the whole point. This wasn't about spectacle. It was about rebirth. Halcyon sanctuaries. The name now echoed softly through hallways, printed on fresh stationery, stitched into spa linens, whispered between staff who knew what it meant. The rebrand was more than a new name. It was a declaration. A quiet, resolute stand. Orion Holdings, once cloaked in secrecy by necessity, was now stepping into the light, not for prestige, not for validation, but to serve its true purpose. Judith stood beside me as I signed the final documents to cement the change. We had worked endlessly to ensure every asset, every location, every last contract aligned with the mission. Halcyon wasn't just a corporation now, it was a living network of sanctuaries. Places of peace, dignity, and refuge, designed not for the elite, but for the unseen. The silenced. The survivors. "It's ready," she said, sliding the last folder across the table to me. I looked down at the embossed logo, soft gold on ivory. A minimalist bird in flight. My father's initials subtly etched into the wing design. It was beautiful. Purposeful. Everything he had dreamed. The mission was clear. Halcyon sanctuaries would operate with dual layers, luxury retreat experiences open to the public, and discreet safe haven services interwoven behind the scenes. Every property would have silent intake protocols, coded reservation systems that partnered with vetted organizations worldwide. A woman escaping coercive control could check into a beachside bungalow without anyone ever knowing she was fleeing. A teenager outed and abandoned could find a private suite with a view of the sea, no questions asked, and access to therapists trained in trauma recovery. Halcyon wasn't about saving people. My father had taught me that long ago. It was about giving people space to save themselves. We'd already begun retraining staff, updating systems, securing partnerships with advocacy groups, shelters, and legal aid teams. But none of it would have felt real until today. Until I stood here, in the very heart of what my father had quietly built and made it mine, not just by name, but by intention. "It's time," I said, lifting my gaze. Judith gave a subtle nod. Across the courtyard, a modest camera crew, handpicked, discreet, briefed, began their live stream. The only audience that mattered would be watching online, the ones looking for a sign that safety still existed somewhere in this fractured world. I stepped up to the podium and exhaled. "Good afternoon," I began, the Mediterranean sun warm on my shoulders. "My name is Evelyn Mercer, and today I'm here not to celebrate wealth, but to honor a promise, one made by a man who saw beyond boardrooms and brand names, and into the quiet pain of people who had nowhere else to go." I paused, letting the silence breathe. My father, Caleb Mercer, built a global collection of resort properties, Orion Holdings, intentionally hidden from the spotlight. But his purpose wasn't secrecy. It was protection. Each location was designed not just for comfort, but for healing, for escape, for rebuilding. I saw Judith's eyes glisten from the side. Today, I am proud to officially reintroduce Orion Holdings as Halcyon Sanctuaries, a global network of retreats whose mission is simple: to provide safety, dignity, and renewal for those who have been emotionally, financially, or psychologically abused. Our properties remain open to the public, yes, but quietly, intentionally, they will now serve another purpose. A higher one. I held up one of the guest welcome guides, newly printed. In every Halcyon property, you'll find compassion disguised as hospitality. There are phone lines that connect to crisis support disguised as concierge services. There are guest-only events led by trauma-informed staff. Rooms designed with the vulnerable in mind. Nothing flashy. Nothing performative. Just peace. Just space. I glanced at the camera. I didn't need to appeal to investors or critics. I was speaking to the ones watching from shelters. From couches that didn't feel safe. From places of uncertainty. I was speaking to the Evelyn I used to be, the one who smiled through parties and pretended everything was fine while people talked over her head and plotted behind her back. "You don't have to explain your pain to be welcome here," I said gently. "You just have to arrive. We'll take care of the rest." The speech ended. The cameras shut off. The courtyard returned to its quiet hum, the scent of oranges lingering like a benediction. Later that night, I walked through the corridors of the Barcelona property. Staff greeted me with quiet nods of recognition. A woman in her 60s touched my hand as I passed and whispered, "Thank you for seeing people like us." She didn't explain what she meant. She didn't need to. That was the thing about Halcyon. It wasn't about proving pain. It was about believing it without question. This was my legacy now. Not an empire of marble and menus, but a sanctuary made of stories, and healing, and light. Solara Bay was unlike any of the other properties. Tucked between tall sea cliffs and dense cypress groves, it barely showed up on satellite maps. The road leading in was narrow and winding, designed that way on purpose to make arrival feel like crossing into another world. I stood barefoot on the veranda that overlooked the ocean, early morning mist still clinging to the air like a secret. The waves rolled in steady rhythm, not loud, not crashing, just constant, like breath. This was the first Halcyon sanctuary fully redesigned under the new mission. Every inch of Solara Bay had been touched by purpose. The guest rooms had soft-locked doors and handwritten notes welcoming each guest by their first name only. The dining area was arranged with quiet alcoves instead of long communal tables. The staff had been trained not to hover, not to ask, just to be present. We didn't have a front desk. Instead, a small welcome cottage at the edge of the drive held everything one might need to begin again: new toiletries, gently worn clothing, local maps, and contact information for support services. Everything was optional. Everything was quiet. I watched as a car pulled slowly into the gravel loop, tires crunching softly, engine humming low. A woman stepped out, her face turned away from the building at first, like she needed just a few extra seconds of silence before stepping into whatever this next chapter might be. She had a boy with her, 7 or 8, maybe. He held her hand tightly, his small backpack nearly as big as his body. They didn't have much. Just a suitcase between them, wheels dusty from travel. I didn't need to know her story. That was the point. No one at Halcyon would ever ask her to tell it unless she wanted to. The moment she crossed the threshold of the sanctuary, her survival became her strength, not a liability to explain. The welcome coordinator stepped out of the cottage, greeting her with a soft smile and 2 keycards already prepared. No names were spoken aloud. Just gestures. Eye contact. A warm nod toward the path leading to her private bungalow. The woman nodded back. Her shoulders loosened, just slightly, and the boy tugged at her arm, pointing toward the cove trail. They walked in that direction instead of going straight to the room. I watched them go, my hand resting lightly on the railing, my own breath matching the cadence of the sea. I saw myself in her. Not in specifics, hers was a life I would never assume to understand, but in energy. In the way she looked over her shoulder like she was making sure the world behind her had truly let go. In the tightness around her mouth that I knew wasn't anger, but a practiced stillness, one that formed when you spent years swallowing your own truth just to keep peace. That had been me. At Clearwater. At every Langford gala. Standing beside Damien with my dress zipped to the top and my voice zipped shut to match. And now, here I was. Not broken. Not erased. Just here. I made my way down to the cove trail, sandals in hand, the path softened by pine needles and fog. The cliffs rose like gentle guards on either side, offering protection rather than isolation. My father had walked this land once. I could almost see his footprints in the sand. The memory of his voice came to me as it always did in these quiet places. You don't have to shout to be heard. Just be undeniable. I reached the overlook where the trail ended. Below, waves lapped against smooth black stones. I sat on the bench Caleb had once installed facing the horizon, its plaque reading, "For the ones who made it out." I stayed there for a long time. The boy and his mother passed behind me later, their shoes crunching gently. I glanced at them just enough to catch her smile, small, cautious, but real. I returned it without words. That was enough. Back at the main house, I walked through the library, touching the spines of books arranged by emotion, not alphabet. For rest, one section read. For grief, another. There was a corner labeled, "For Starting Over," filled with stories of resilience, memoirs of those who had lost everything and found something better in its place. That was what Halcyon had become. Not just a business, not a headline, not a revenge tale tied up in ribbon. It was a quiet walk forward. A space where beginnings weren't tied to someone else's permission. Where silence was no longer punishment, but peace. Judith arrived later that afternoon. We didn't speak much. We didn't need to. We sat together on the back patio with mugs of mint tea and watched the sun dip slowly toward the water, casting everything in gold. I thought about how far we'd come, how far I had come, from the night I'd stood on the balcony at Clearwater, humiliated and discarded. Now I was building something that couldn't be undone by whispers or paper signed in shadows. My legacy wasn't gilded in applause. It was carved in courage. In sanctuaries. In a quiet woman and her child arriving with nothing but a suitcase and hope. And that was enough. That was everything.